Okay, we are recording. I assume if you're watching this, it is for credit. Um, as usual, throughout this lecture, I'll give a set series of attendance words or attendance phrases. And what you'll need to do is write those down when I say them. And then in addition, you'll need to take a screenshot when I say them. And then when it's all over, send me an email that has the list of the list of attendance words with the accompanying screenshots, and then one question about the material covered in the lecture. Something that's relatively new. Also, you can get a little bit of extra credit if you like the video or comment on the video. And then, when you send that email with the screenshots, also include that. Say also, I'd love to comment and use a screenshot that shows I love to comment. Just for a little bit of extra credit. And the other thing I'll tell you too before we move forward, or before I give you the first word, is again just a reminder: these announcements are for 101-02 in the spring of 2026. So if you are not in that course, some of this stuff might not pertain to you. Right? The material does, but when I talk about dates and labs, things like that, that's not necessarily pertaining to you. Anyway, that being said, first word for attendance is going to be a circle right here on the screen. So when you take a screenshot, let's see if it's circled. And the first word is Friday. Friday is the first word for attendance. Now, it is about 7:40 here, and no one's here yet, so we're not going to officially get started. Probably for another, I don't know, 25, excuse me, maybe 15 minutes. Probably get started in 15 minutes. So if you're watching this, you can skip ahead about 15 minutes. Morning. Yeah, I fixed the lap sheet graduate. What happened this semester, we had these worksheets for a while, and then I might update them next semester, but for some reason this semester they all just went, they got locked, and I had to permission everybody to use them. I don't know what happened.
Are you talking about lab 8?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should be good. So. Marley's here, Savannah's here. Zayda's here. Very weird. Interesting. Morning. So Eric is here. And Lucas is here. Got less than 3 minutes, so I might as well do the redundant announcements. So again, still retaking exam 1 until Friday. Highly recommend doing it. I know one of you did it. I saw the email after Monday. I don't remember if I got back to you or not yet, but I'll get there. So I'll change your grade. But remember, after Friday, you can still retake exam 1 for the practice of it, but you can't retake exam 1 to change your grade. So Friday is the day. You have until then to retake the exam to change your grade, which will be helpful because I have to turn in midterm grades after that. So, give you a nice little buffer. After Friday too, I can meet you online and give you feedback for exam work, give you all the correct answers that you'll need to help study for the final exam. Plus, as is the case with any assignment, if you meet me and get detailed feedback for your assignment, you get a 5% boost to that grade. So keep that in mind. Speaking of Friday, exam 2 is when we're going to meet here to do the online exam. Bring a computer, bring a charger. Let me know if you need a computer and a charger. We'll have 50 minutes, obviously, to take about an exam that is about 15 questions long. If you need more time, you can come in early. I should probably be here about, I don't know, let's call it 7:40 at the latest. But I'm usually here before 7:20. But anyway, if you come in early, you can start as soon as you get here. What else to say about that? Also, if you just want more time, or you get test anxiety, or for some reason you just know you'd like to sleep in on Fridays, I don't know, whatever the case may be, again, if you want to make alternate arrangements to take exam 2, if you don't want to do it here, you need to let me know beforehand. Just miss it, don't talk to me, or if you email me the night before, that means you missed it, you got a 0. Of course, you can always retake the exam 2 later. And then, if you get 100 on the retake and a 0 the first time, that'll average out to 50, which is still failing, but it's a lot better than 2. Any questions about exam 1 or exam 2? All right, redundant stuff too. Lab 7, as you know, is today. Make sure you bring a computer because it's 100% online. Basically, what we'll do is I'll pull up the worksheet and show you a few things, and then I'll be here if you need me to show you more stuff individually. So that's how that's going to work. And then when you're done with the lab, you can just leave. Any questions about lab today? All right, pre-lab 8 is due on Friday, as usual. This looks bad when I have it all listed out, but it's really not that bad. So you have one video with a set of questions to watch, one introduction to read with, one video with a set of questions to answer about the video, one little introduction with a set of questions about the introduction, a list of hypotheses, and then you'll have 2 tables where you just have to fill half of them out. And that part's going to be easy because you're just going to be describing yourself. Like, for example, like, oh, yeah, I have a cleft chin. So you write the thing there. Or I don't have blue eyes. So you write the thing there. But anyway, as usual, when you're doing that, even though it's due on Friday, I can help you. I can help you today during lab if you want. So, again, you never have to do any of these things alone. They're not exams. I'm not testing you to see how much you know. I'm just trying to prepare you, the pre-labs anyway. I'm trying to prepare you to get ready for the lab so you come in ready to learn and get the most out of it. So let me know if you need help with that. It is 8 o'clock. Well, I'll keep moving. So attendance is going to be as usual today, except since it's the last lecture for, well, no, I'll get to that later. Let's just, for now, just say it's attendance as usual, right? Write down the attendance words. If you're watching the video, take a screenshot. At the end of it, make sure you include one question about the material covered. And then one other thing I want to say, and I've said it before, but I want to say it again, reiterate this. You guys are doing great. As a class, you guys, this is the best semester I've seen in a while. I've made some changes, like the mandatory participation and stuff like that. But as a class, you guys are doing very well. There are at least 2 people who are like never show up for lab or lectures. So if you know any of your classmates who aren't showing up, you might want to remind them, like, hey, this is mandatory attendance, and you have to be there. So that would help your classmates. But yeah, as a whole, you guys are doing amazing, and you should keep it up. So any questions about any of this? All right, I'm going to take attendance and then shut the door. And then we'll get started. Ashley is here. Barrett is here. Wooten, not here. Trahan is here. Dickens is not here. Clark is not here. Nika is here. Isaiah is here. Copes, not here. Smith is not here. Watson, not here. Kaylee is here. Lucas is here. Marley is here. Noah is here. Savannah is here. Mia is here. Edwards is not here. Wilkes is not here. Did I miss anybody? All right, let's get started. And again, there's no questions about anything on the board, right? highly recommend retaking that first exam. Cannot hurt your grade and all that. Anyway, where are we at here? The first word for attendance going to be the underlined word there, which is about. The first word for attendance. Of course, if you're watching the video, that's your second word for attendance. Anyway, there's no questions. Let's jump into it. I'm gonna try to go a little bit quick today, because some of this material is what. Oh yeah, sorry.
Currently absent.
Just now?
Yeah.
Last name?
Watson.
Thank you. Sorry. Better to tell me now. Thank you. There we go. I got you now. Thanks. Anyway, I'm gonna try to go through this pretty quickly because today's lab is on this chapter. So in a sense, it's kind of sucks that we haven't gotten farther. But I don't know. At least you'll learn it in the lecture. Excuse me. You get a good grasp of it in the lab, and then maybe that'll help you learn it when we get to it in the lecture. Assuming we don't get to it today. So here we go. This is chapter 6. This is about reproduction at the cellular level. And in a way, all of exam 3 is kind of about reproduction. If you remember in chapter 1, when we talked about the properties of life, reproduction was one of those properties of life. So you're going to learn how cells reproduce. You're going to learn genetics, which is obviously the result of cellular reproduction. You're going to learn about DNA duplication, which is obviously also about reproduction. So this is where we'll get started, reproduction at the cellular level. Once again, I'll remind you, this PowerPoint is based strongly off of the old textbook. So some of the stuff will be a little bit out of order. If there's anything in this lecture or in this PowerPoint that's not in your textbook that you need to know, as always, I'll make sure, hey, write that down. That's something you need to know. It's not in your textbook. Normally, I would play with those or talk about what these little pictures mean. But like I said, I'd like to be in a hurry to get to the important stuff. So one of the other things about the old textbook, and I've deleted them from most of the other PowerPoints, but I kept it on here just because I thought it was slightly interesting. I'm going to skip through it. You can read it if you want. But at the beginning of every chapter of the old textbook had something called biology and society. And it's this new current event that was relevant to that particular chapter. And you can read about it if you want. But long story short, there's some animals that don't need sexual, well, there's going to be a lot of animals that don't need sexual reproduction. But sometimes there's larger, more complicated animals like this shark, for example, that can do reproduction on their own, and they don't need sexual reproduction. And that is called something called parthenogenesis. You can read into it if you want. Another good example of that, even though it's fiction, was the movie Jurassic Park. Remember that they said, oh, they're all females, the first movie, so they can't reproduce. But then it turns out they had some DNA from some animals that could reproduce on their own, and that's how it happened. So, anyway, this chapter is going to be broken down into 2 main sections. We're going to talk about what cellular reproduction accomplishes, and then we'll get into the cell cycle and mitosis. Again, this is a different order than the textbook. Another thing that's different is, like I said, well, you can see here, in this chapter, we're going to talk about mitosis. And notice in the lab, there's also a little bit about meiosis. So meiosis will not be until next chapter. But with the old textbook, mitosis and meiosis were the same chapter. Anyway, let's get into it. Reproduction. Now, obviously, when you think of reproduction, you probably think of that first bullet point. Reproduction may result in the birth of a new organism, right? When you think of reproduction, I think a lot of people think, yeah, it's like when someone has a baby, and that is one type of reproduction. But the important thing to keep in mind is there's another type of reproduction because it's more common. It involves the production of new cells. So if I wasn't in such a rush before I went to that slide, I probably would ask you, how many of you have reproduced before? Probably, I would assume most of you won't raise your hands. If any of you do have kids, you probably would raise your hands. But then I would say, technically, all of you should raise your hands because all of you have reproduced. And all of you are reproducing as you sit here. Because again, that same bullet point. Reproduction more often involves the production of new cells. So yes, we will in this chapter talk a little bit about sexual reproduction, like the kind that you think about, but more than that, we're going to focus on how cells reproduce. Cells undergo reproduction, which is also called cell division. I'm probably not even going to use that word. I just put it in bold because that was a a vocabulary word from the old textbook. I don't even know if it is with the new textbook, but either way, I'm not going to use it. You'll see why, because there's different types of cellular division. But in doing this, it produces two daughter cells. So you start with one cell, you end up with two daughter cells. There'll be exceptions to that, and you'll need to know those exceptions when we get there. But for now, just think about that. One cell splits into two. And I will use the term daughter cell, so you will need to know that, not because I'm going to ask you what a daughter cell is, it's because I'm going to be using that term, so I don't want you to get lost when I'm using it. So these two new daughter cells are genetically identical to each other and to that parent cell. So again, you have this one cell, and then it splits into two, and you end up with two new cells, two new daughter cells, and they are genetically identical to the first one. And again, there's going to be some exceptions to that, but we're not going to get to the exceptions yet. Right now, we're just starting with the basics. So are there any questions about this slide? All right, earlier in the semester, you were introduced to some terms, and I told you they would come back, and here they are, they're coming back. For example, I think it was chapter 2, we talked about nucleic acids. We also talked about chromosomes. So here we are talking about them again. Definitely in chapter 4, I think it was, 5, 3. Whichever it was when we rushed through the cell stuff, right? All the different parts of the cell. So here we are again. So before a cell can divide, it has to duplicate its chromosomes. And you can write that down if you want. But later, and then we will talk about that a little bit more in this chapter. And then in chapters a little bit later, that will also be on exam 3. By the way, this is all exam 3 stuff. We'll have a whole chapter where we really dig into how these chromosomes duplicate. So you'll learn the basics of it in this chapter, and then in another chapter, we'll really dig into it. Cellular division plays the roles in the lives of organisms. You can read them right there. These are things you need to know. They replace lost or damaged cells. It's also used for growth, right? Because at one point in your life, you were one cell, right? When that sperm and the egg came together, that was then one cell called a zygote. We'll learn about that later. And it's not like that thing just got bigger and you're just one huge cell, right? What happened instead is the cell reproduced many times. So from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8, 16, so on and so forth. And then, of course, regular old reproduction, which will be next chapter. And by reproduction, I'm talking about like sexual reproduction, like creating a new organ. So yeah, you need to know how this is used, right? Again, replace lost or damaged cells, growth, and the reproduction, like creating a new organ. So next slide I'm going to show you, to show some pictures as an example. It's from the old textbook. Again, I'm trying to go quick, so if I'm going too quick, just slow me down. But here's the pictures from the old textbook. So here we can see a kidney cell that's reproducing, probably a cell replacement, right? So probably a kidney cell died, so now it needs to be replaced. So this one that was alive has now gone through mitosis, which is what you're about to learn about. And now it's in the middle of splitting into 2 new cells. And then again, growth, like I said, at one point in your life, you were 1 cell. And then you divided into 2, and then 4, and then 8, 16, 64. And that's what that picture is. And then, like I said, sometimes reproduction, as in creating a new organism. So that's how amoebas, not that you need to know, this is just an example, but for example, that's how an amoeba will create a new amoeba, right? It goes to the cellular reproduction. And there's also some slightly interesting ones, I think. And academically, it's less important, but it is worth mentioning. So I don't know if you know what happens when you cut off the arm of the sea star. It grows a new arm. But also, the arm that got cut off, as you can see in this picture, grows a new sea star. So some animals are able to do that, or like lizards, right? You know, some lizards, they'll lose their tail and grow a new one. There's a lot of examples. You can look them up for extra credit. And then here, growth of a clipping. I don't know if you've ever done that. I do it all the time. Like if you buy herbs from the grocery store, for example, you put them in water. Oftentimes they'll make roots, and of course you can put that into the ground, and now you've got a whole new plant based off of that. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Okay, and again, these are all examples. You don't need to know anything about kidney cells or human embryos or amoebas or sea stars or clippings. These are just examples. So what we've been talking about, and I haven't given it this term yet, I think I've said it, but I'm going to officially tell you what it's called now. It's called asexual reproduction is what we've been talking about. You're going to need to know the difference between asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. And in many ways, they're the opposite of each other. So asexual reproduction does not require, or doesn't, it can't use egg and sperm, right? You cannot use egg and sperm in asexual reproduction. As we already mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the two daughter cells, the parent and the offsprings have identical genes. Which reminds me, let me take a quick step back here. So, yes, we're talking about asexual reproduction. So specifically, we're talking about creating a new organism, right? This is how single-celled organisms reproduce. And if you want, you can look up and see if there's any exceptions to that for extra credit. Single-celled organisms reproduce via asexual reproduction. But if you remember some of the conversations we were having about respiration, for example, about how prokaryotes don't have organelles, therefore they can't go through respiration the way I taught it, so they have some other version of it. But remember, there was also some single-celled eukaryotes, so you can think about that. Is this just talking about prokaryotes, or are we also talking about eukaryotes? There are single-celled protists. There are single-celled fungi, things like that. And again, that would be extra credit. Academically, all that would be unimportant because you don't need to know that for any of the material moving forward. But it's not just single-celled organisms that reproduce this way. Again, I already gave you these examples. The sea star, right? They cut off an arm of a sea star, it grows back. Clippings of a plant. A sponge. A sponge is technically an animal. It's one of the most basic animals there is. If you squish it through like a spaghetti strainer or whatever, and so there's just like thousands of new cells based on that one, used to be one organism. Each one of those new clumps is going to grow a new organism. Well, whichever ones don't die in the process, but generally speaking, that's how it works. I put others there with a question mark because that would be another great extra credit topic to look into if you want. What are some other multicellular organisms that go through asexual reproduction? Any questions about this slide? Okay, your next word for attendance. It's not a word at all necessarily. I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to answer it. The question is, where are you going for spring break? So I'm just curious. So if it's nowhere, you could write nowhere. Or I'm staying here. Just curious where you're going for spring break. Of course, if you're watching the video and you take a screenshot of the attendance word, I should see a picture of the where I wrote SB for spring break. So any questions? Okay. So that's asexual reproduction, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. Which brings us to what we're really focused on in this chapter is mitosis, right? Mitosis is what we use for things to, for these organisms to reproduce that way, to reproduce asexually. But again, like I've already mentioned, mitosis is also used for growth and maintenance. Okay? So yes, asexual reproduction is accomplished via mitosis, which is the majority of what this chapter is about. But again, also, it's for growth and maintenance. So you all, even though you don't reproduce, as in you don't create a new human via mitosis, well, I guess you could make an argument against that too, but anyway, you are doing mitosis right now, right? You are using mitosis to take care of your body, right? You're growing new cells, you're fixing old ones, things like that. Growth and maintenance. Just to make sure I'm not going too fast while this is still up here, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about the exam. So this exam, when it comes to mitosis, as you're going to learn, there's different phases of mitosis. And a lot of the questions are going to be like, in which phase does this happen? In which phase does that happen? What would happen to a cell if it got stuck in this phase, things like that. So keep that in the back of your mind once we get there. If there's no questions about this side, I'm going to move forward again. Let me know if I'm going too fast. I just want to cover a lot so you have a little bit of an introduction before we get into the lab. Of course, if you've already done the pre-lab, you probably already know some of the stuff I'm going to teach you today. Anyway, the opposite of asexual reproduction is obviously sexual reproduction. And yeah, we'll officially cover it next chapter, but I thought now is a good time to at least bring it up for the first time, because there will be some questions where you need to know the difference between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So when I brought up asexual reproduction, I said, in many ways, asexual reproduction is just the opposite of sexual. For example, on asexual reproduction, we don't use egg and sperm. In sexual reproduction, we do. Asexual reproduction is accomplished strictly by mitosis, right? That's what we talked about previously. Sexual reproduction starts with this process of meiosis, which we're going to again talk about in the next chapter. But basically, long story short, like if you don't remember anything else about meiosis, you need to know meiosis is what is used to produce egg and sperm. Yeah, we're going to learn a lot more in between there, but if you don't remember that, then all those other little details won't matter. So again, you should associate asexual reproduction with mitosis, sexual reproduction with meiosis. The next slide really should have been on here. I don't know why I had them on two different sides, but I'll give it a second. Oh yeah, speaking of meiosis. So this lab that we're doing today, you've already done pre-lab, so you know there's like 3 Google Forms for the pre-lab. And the downside about Google Forms is once you've done them, you can't fix them. But there's an extra credit video at the bottom of the worksheet that's about sperm. It's called The Great Sperm Race. It's slightly interesting, but anyway, you watch that and answer the questions. I can apply those extra credit points directly to your lab. And if you have any left over, like if that gives you a full credit, then those extra credit points will move to your course total. Sort of like last week. You had your grade for the photosynthesis lab, but also there's the virtual one. If you do the virtual one, those points will be applied to your photosynthesis lab, and any leftovers will be applied to your course total. Anyway, any questions about this slide? The next one's, yeah, it should be on this slide. It's same concepts here. So again, there's two types of cellular division in the lives of sexually reproducing organisms, like us, right? We are sexually reproducing. We are not asexually reproducing. And for us, and I'm going to be saying this a lot because people forget this, and you're going to miss this on an exam. Somebody will. We use mitosis for growth and maintenance, and we use meiosis for the reproduction, to create the new organism. So we do both. Sometimes people get confused and they get really focused on, all right, mitosis is asexual reproduction. So only those organisms do mitosis. No, we do both. Sort of like how people very often forget that plants, that they focus so much on the fact that plants do photosynthesis, they kind of forget that, oh yeah, they also do respiration. Same here, right? Sexually reproducing organisms do both. We're making good time. That is the end of the first major bullet point of this chapter. Of course, the second major bullet point that you're going to see on the next slide has a lot more to it. Don't go too fast. All right. So this part, we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about eukaryotic chromosomes, which I feel like I can go through quickly because you've already been introduced to this in chapter 2 when you learned about nucleotides, and in chapter 3 when you learned about eukaryotic chromosomes. But we'll dig a little deeper this time. Then we're going to learn a little bit about duplicating chromosomes, which you're going to learn a lot more about in later chapters. Then we're going to talk about the cell cycle, and as far as the exam is concerned, there'll be a lot more test questions on that in these 2 bullet points. These 2 bullet points, you just need to understand them to understand this stuff. But then, yeah, then we'll get to the cell cycle, which will have a lot of stuff that you need to know for the exam. Mitosis and cytokinesis, which is going to be a majority of this chapter, will be represented in the exam by that. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about cancer and how this is related to cancer. So here we go. Again, to remind you, we are talking about eukaryotic chromosomes now. We're focused on eukaryotes. We're not focused on prokaryotes. I might bring them up every once in a while, but for the most part, we're just going to focus on eukaryotes. And remind you, we are eukaryotes, right? We are the more advanced life forms. We have larger cells. We have organelles. So as you already know from previous chapter, for us, most genes are located on chromosomes in the nucleus, and you need to know that. And remember, there are some exceptions. That second bullet point there, we mentioned this before. Mitochondria have their own genome. If any of you done in 23andMe and things like that, you're probably a little bit familiar with that. Mitochondrial DNA, that only comes from your mom, right? Which only came from her mom, which only came from her mom, so on and so forth. Each chromosome contains one long DNA molecule that has thousands of genes. Now, they're all different sizes, which means the number of genes changes, but thousands is a good term. I'm not going to ask you how many genes there are, because, again, it does vary. Because some of them are huge, some of them are small. And I'm not even just talking about different species either. I mean, even just with humans, as you're going to learn later, and in lab today, you're going to see there's really big chromosomes. Like the biggest one is chromosome number 1. And then they get smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to the smallest, which is the sex chromosomes. And obviously, the size matters when it comes to this because it's just a bunch of nucleotides. The more nucleotides you have, the more genes you can have. The chromosome number depends on the species. I also put it next to that. That's not going to be a test question, but it's just so you know. That's one of the ways we can identify a species. But it's not like each species has a specific number. On the next slide, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. And in that example, a lot of them do have the same chromosome number. I mean, each one of them has different chromosome numbers. But anyway, the point is sort of like, remember when we talked about periodic table, right? And I said the number of protons defines the atom, the element, right? It's almost like that with chromosomes, but again, not necessarily, because, for example, as you're going to see in the next slide, we humans have 46 chromosomes. Now, that doesn't mean there's no other species that have 46 chromosomes, but that does mean unless there's something wrong genetically, then every human on Earth, again, unless there's something wrong with it, has 46 chromosomes. So you can almost define it. Like, as part of the definition of being human. But this brings us to a term you do need to know. Not because I'm necessarily going to ask about it on the exam. I don't know if I'm going to or not. But I'm definitely going to use this term. And the term is genome. That is the cell's complete complement of DNA. At least that's how the old textbook defined it. I think another good definition for genome is it's all the genes in an organism. Your genome is all your genes. I like that too better. You'll learn a little bit later why saying a complete complement of DNA is slightly better than saying all the genes. Because there's some DNA, obviously, that make up DNA that makes up the genes. All genes are made up of DNA. But there is some DNA on your chromosomes that are technically not part of your genes. We'll learn about that too. Anyway, any questions about this slide before I show you a picture that gives examples of that chromosome? That bullet point. Okay, here we go. This is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any of this on the exam. It's from the old textbook, so I included it. I just thought it was slightly interesting. So you can see here, again, humans have 46 chromosomes. That's the one you will need to know, but we'll bring that up a lot between now and chapter 3 too. So that number should be easy for you to remember. But yeah, the rest of these are just examples. And I do like it though, because here, like the one, at least in this example, the one with the fewest number of chromosomes is a full-size deer. Well, I don't know about full size. I don't know how big it is, to be honest. But then you can see here in this example, the one with the most chromosomes is a rat, which I thought was funny, right? Because it's not necessarily the size. The size of the animal does not necessarily dictate the number of chromosomes, right? Like a giraffe is much bigger than a human. They only have 30 chromosomes. We have 46, right? So don't feel like it has anything to do with the size. For extra credit, this is a good extra credit topic. Just think about any organism that you're interested in. Tell me how many chromosomes it has. If you like cats, If you really like palm trees, whatever, it doesn't have to be an apple. Whatever it is that you're interested in, just look it up and say, hey, I looked it up according to this source. My goldfish has this many chromosomes, whatever it may be. Any questions about that side? All right, some more stuff that you already know. This is a review. Hopefully I can go through it quickly. We learned about this in chapter 2 and in chapter 3. Chromosomes are made up of something called chromatin. I told you that before. Here it is again. Usually chromatin consists of thin fibers that are much longer than the nucleus itself. So yeah, they're all in the nucleus, but they're much longer, which tells you they're all kind of squished up together to be able to fit into the nucleus. Chromatin is made up of half DNA and half protein. That's something you really need to know with these exams. But I may or may not ask you what the proteins do. I'll put a question mark to that part. But that will be important later. Like between now and when we take chapter 3, there's some other concepts I'm going to teach you. To truly understand that, you need to remember this chromatin, this DNA is also wrapped up in some proteins that help organize it and control the activity of genes. So obviously, like next week, for example, your lab's about genetics. We won't get that deep yet, but eventually we'll get deeper into it. And you're going to need to think about how that works at the molecular level. That's when we're going to get back to this discussion. This idea that the fact that these chromosomes have protein and they play a role. I may or may not ask you this. If you fully extend a DNA molecule that is over 2 meters long, or it's a lot, some people would say that over 6 feet long. It's pretty long when you think about it. That means every single cell in your body has over 2 meters of DNA in it. So that's a lot. Think about all that, how crammed up that must be to fit not only inside of each cell, but inside the nucleus of each cell. So it's really squished. As cells prepare to divide, the chromosomes coil up, which we'll talk about in detail later. So if you're taking notes, you don't need to write that down yet, unless you want to. They also form compact structures that can be seen with microscopes, so that's what happens when they coil up. And I used to give you an example of that on the next slide. So again, later in this chapter, there's going to be a whole little section when we talk about that one bullet point, about them preparing to divide and the chromosomes coiling up. So for now, this is just an introduction to that concept. We'll come back to it. So when they're not dividing, and when those chromosomes have not coiled up, they're too thin to be seen, even with a microscope. You can't, I mean, you can see it, and you'll see it on the next slide what I mean. And you'll see in today's lab, there'll be pictures like, oh yeah, I can see this mess, this glob, but I can't tell one chromosome from the other. So that's what they look like when they're not preparing to divide. They're just uncoiled. It's just a big blurry mess. So any questions about this slide before I show you a picture that demonstrates what's on this slide? All right, here's some chromosomes, right? You can see that's an individual chromosome, right? That's an individual chromosome. Each one of those, you can see the chromosomes. This is a cell that's not preparing to divide. So you can just see it's a big blurry mess. All those chromosomes are unraveled. They have not coiled up. And again, we're going to talk later about exactly how that happens. And when we talk about exactly how it happens, then we'll talk about why it happens too. Hopefully, once you understand why it happens, you understand how. And when. As far as the exam is concerned, when it happens is more important than any of the other stuff. So any questions about that slide? Okay. Your next word for attendance it's another question that I want you to answer. That's related to the last one. You could go anywhere for spring break. Where would you go? If you can't think of anything, like if someone asked me that, I couldn't answer it. I have too many choices. Just pick one and write it down. Anyway, again, like we said, this chromatin, which makes up chromosomes, right? It's made up of half DNA and half proteins. And this DNA is packed into an elaborate multi-level system of coiling and folding And that's part of what it uses these proteins for. These particular proteins are called histones. I might ask you what a histone is in the exam, but I'm definitely going to talk about histones, especially in a later chapter. So for now, this is just an introduction. But those histones are the proteins that are used to package the DNA. So the next slide, I'm going to show you a picture of the DNA wrapped around the histones, and this will make a lot more sense when I do. When the histones wrap around the DNA, that little grouping, when they come together like that, we call that a nucleosome. And again, that should make a lot more sense when I show you the picture on the next slide. But again, this is an introduction. That will be something we talk more about later chapters. Still in chapter exam 3, later chapters. Speaking of exam 3, this is the last exam where we focus on cells, right? So far, it's everything in cells, like how cells do respiration, how cells do photosynthesis, how cells reproduce. After chapter 3, we start getting into the stuff that I enjoy more, but we start talking about how organisms interact with each other. We start looking at big picture stuff. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Again, the next slide is going to be a visualization of what's on this slide. And again, this is just an introduction, a preview that we're going to talk about in greater detail later. So I'm going through it quickly. So there we go. There's your DNA double helix. Each one of these little beads, right? That's a protein called a histone. And you can see the DNA wraps around it. There's 8 histones together. And we call each one of those little clumps of 8 histones wrapped around, or with the DNA wrapped around it, we call that a nucleosome. And again, I'm not really sure if I'm going to ask you what that is during the exam, but those are terms I'm definitely going to use. Histone, nucleosome, especially later in later chapters. But yeah, when you look at it with a microscope, which is what this picture is here, you can literally, they just look like beads on a string, like pearl necklace or something. That's what it looks like. So any questions about that? All right, the next picture is just kind of zooming out even more, right? So you can see we've zoomed in a lot to see this one DNA double helix. We've kind of zoomed out a little bit to see this. Now we're going to zoom out even more to see the whole chromosome, right? So you can see, again, that's, like I said, it's highly compacted and highly coiled and highly organized. All those little DNA wrapped around the nucleosomes in a very organized, uniform manner. And then that itself coils up in a very organized, uniform manner. And then that itself has its own little shape where it kind of does that in a very organized, uniform manner, right? And that's what a chromosome is. And of course, when we zoomed out, that's an actual picture, microscope picture of what a chromosome looks like. Again, they're all different sizes, so they might look a little bit different. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Here's a term that I'm going to teach you later, but it's on the slide, so I might as well bring it up. What we're actually looking at here, because I just said it was a chromosome, technically that was inaccurate. Technically, that's a duplicated chromosome, and this will make more sense when I teach it later. But there's a little center part here called centromere that I'm going to teach you about later. And what you have here is one chromosome right there that's duplicated itself, so that's the second chromosome. And they're still attached to each other at the place called the centromere. And technically, those things are called now sister chromatids. And again, I'll officially teach you all that later. But the point is, that thing has already duplicated itself. So any questions about what the next slide has to say? Yeah, next slide just brings it all together. So any questions about this? All right, really quickly, let's talk about duplicated chromosomes. This is just an overview. You're going to learn a little bit about it now. You learn about it in one context, where now we're more focused on when it happens. And then later, in a different chapter, you're going to learn how it happens at the molecular level. So here we go. Again, before a cell can divide, it has to copy its DNA, right? It has to duplicate its chromosomes. So yeah, just like I said in the previous slide, I'm going to teach you later. Now it's later. So officially, I'm teaching you now. When a chromosome duplicates itself, the result is called a sister chromatid, right? So instead of just having one chromosome, which would look like something like this, that's just one chromosome. But then once it duplicates itself, it would look more like this. And at that point, we call those, each one of those is a sister chromatid, right? There's two sister chromatids, one here, one here. Some important things you need to know about these sister chromatids is they contain identical genes. And that'll be really important when we start talking about genetics. So when I say identical, I mean identical. And you'll see what I mean later. So because there's different versions of genes. So there might be the same gene, but different versions of it. But in this case, there's no different versions. It's the same gene, identical genes. For example, how many of you have a chin dimple? We'll talk about that in the next see a few of you have a chin dimple, right? I don't have a chin dimple, but we all have the same gene on the same chromosome that controls whether you have a chin dimple or not. But if you have a chin dimple, you have a different version of that gene than I do. It's the same gene, different version. Again, sister chromatids, they have identical genes, same versions. It's a perfect copy, unless something goes wrong. We'll talk a little bit about that later. These sister chromatids are joined in the middle at something called the centromere. Again, I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to ask you what that word means, but I'm definitely going to use it a lot. In 120, which is the more advanced version of this course, you would learn and get tested on the fact that sometimes we identify which chromosome it is based on where the centromere is. If you can see, I drew that one with the centromere in the middle. Sometimes it's maybe more towards the top, more towards the bottom. We don't have to worry about that. You will see it when we do today's lab. You'll see these different pictures of chromosomes. And you can see that they all have kind of a different shape, depending on which chromosome it is. Anyway, the next slide I'm going to show you is a picture of what's on the screen, and it's from the old textbook. Does anybody have any questions or need me to slow down about this slide before I show you a picture of it? Okay, here we go. So here we have, this is what I tried to draw. Here we have one chromosome, right? There's the centromere. See, that one's more towards the top. I drew mine in the middle. It's just an example. It could be anywhere. This chromosome has duplicated itself. So now instead of having one chromosome, we have two sister chromatids. They're connected at the centromere. Of course, in that picture, they didn't even draw the centromere. They just kind of drew where it would be with those indentations. But yeah, that's what the centromere is. So any questions about that? Okay. So when the cells divide, remember this is the big picture. That's what we're talking about here, is right? We're talking about cellular division. We haven't quite gotten there yet. So far, we just talked about how the chromosomes duplicate. So when they divide, these duplicated chromosomes also separate from each other. That way, each new cell gets a full set of chromosomes. And again, which are a perfect copy of each other. These two daughter cells are genetically identical to themselves and to the original. Anyway, once they are separated, we then consider them full-fledged chromosomes again. And the next picture I'm going to show you was just an illustration of, again, the words that are on the screen. Again, they are identical to the original chromosome. Just to fast forward a little bit, this is mostly what we're going to talk about when we talk about mitosis. It's all about, as far as we're concerned, academically, we're really just concerned about the story of the chromosomes. When did they duplicate? When did they meet up in the middle? When did they separate? Things like that. So again, the next slide will be a picture from the old textbook. It's basically just a part 2 of the last picture we saw. It's going to give you a visualization of the words that are on the screen. All right. Show you. So there we go. We already talked about the chromosome duplication. Now, through mitosis, as you're going to learn, there's a few steps that cause this, but they separate from each other, and now we have 2 full-fledged chromosomes, each one identical to itself, to each other, and to the original chromosome. Of course, this is really oversimplifying things. Like I said earlier, humans, for example, have 46 chromosomes. So when all this is happening, it's not like just this one chromosome is doing this. This is happening 46 different chromosomes. Any questions about that? Good. We're going to get into the important stuff that'll help you with help you with the lab today. So the next thing we're talking about is the cell cycle. So again, as far as the exam is concerned, when we're talking about this chapter, the majority of the questions are going to come from mitosis and cytokinesis. And also a little bit, it's almost half and half cell cycle versus mitosis and cytokinesis. But probably there's a few more questions about mitosis than the cell cycle. But as you're going to learn, mitosis is simply one part of the cell cycle. So let's jump into it. The cell cycle. This is just an ordered sequence of events. There's no need to write that down. That's just explaining what I'm about to explain to you. It's this thing, and then that thing, and then that thing. And it starts when the cell is first formed. Cell cycle starts when it's first formed, and it ends, therefore, when that one splits into two. You could almost think of it like the lifetime of a cell. Of course, when we think of lifetime, and we're thinking of humans, you probably think of birth to death. But in this case, we're not even considering death. Like, obviously, cells do die. But in this case, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the birth of one cell, so to speak, until it goes through the whole cycle and splits into two new cells. One thing you will need to know, and this is going to be easier to understand on the next slide because it's visualized for you. But this is the big picture. You should memorize this before you can start worrying about the other things. The cell cycle itself is broken down into two parts: interphase and mitotic phase. You need to know that. And then, as you'll see as we go through this discussion, then we're going to break interphase down. We're going to divide it some more. And we'll take the mitotic phase and we'll divide it some more. Sort of like if you were talking about the cell cycle, thinking about it as a clock instead. Like the day is divided into two parts, AM and PM. And then you could even divide that into more stuff, right? AM. AM starts in the dark time hours, and then you get, sunrise. And then you get towards noon. And then PM consists of, afternoon, sunset, dark, whatever. Point is, again, with the clock, you can think of it as AM and PM. And then divide that even some more. Same with this. The cell cycle is interphase and mitotic phase. And then we'll break those up some more. So any questions about this slide before I show you the visualization of this? All right. Well, with the visualization, like I said, interphase and mitotic phase are also broken down into more parts. And this picture happens to show that. So this is more than I've taught you so far. This is interphase. Right here, it's a big part. And this is the mitotic phase. So there'll be a question in today's lab where you have to do a hypothesis. So one of the things you can do in today's lab, and we're not going to use actual microscopes, there's going to be pictures provided to you from the website. And they took an onion root, and they just sliced into it, and they took a bunch of pictures of the cells that were in that onion root. Now, based on this, because again, this is to scale, right? Interphase is 90% of the time cells are they're in interphase, right? So only 10% of the time are they in the mitotic phase. So if you had to guess, you're looking at these cells, which one do you think? And again, you can see a bunch of different cells. Do you think you're going to find more cells in the interphase or more cells in the mitotic phase? Because that's a question you're going to have to ask when you get to lab, because it's going to be a hypothesis question. Anybody want to venture a guess? No one? All right. Well, I would guess interphase, just because of what I see here, right? I'm telling you now that most cells spend 90% of their time in interphase. And it's not like every cell in an organism is on the same thing every time. It's not like, all right, all the cells in this onion are now in interphase. Now every single cell has gone to the mitotic phase. It's not like that, right? All these cells are independent of each other. So we may check on that. There we go. So that is an important concept to understand, again, because you're going to have to write hypotheses about this. Another thing to keep in mind, though, so I know I just said, obviously, interphase is going to be a large majority of the cells. But also keep in mind, this is an onion tip, meaning like it's the tip of the root, which means, yes, usually cells are in interphase, but also, remember, mitosis is for growth. So these cells that we're looking at are probably going to be more so than the other cells, a higher representation of the mitotic phase, because they are the part of the cell, the part of the organism that is growing. So you would expect to see more mitotic phase than usual. But again, interphase should probably still overwhelm mitotic phase. So any questions about this? Okay, again, I haven't explained G1. I haven't explained S. I haven't explained G2. But we'll get there. Again, you need to know the big picture before you start adding the details. And the big picture is the cell cycle is broken down into interphase and mitotic phase. Like I've already said, cells are almost always in interphase. 90% of the time, they're in interphase. If you could somehow take one random cell out of your body and keep it alive, just watch it. The time it was created until the time it divides, 90% of that time, it should be an interphase. So what's happening during interphase? I might ask you this, but honestly, again, most of this exam is going to focus on what's happening in mitosis, but let's talk about it anyway. When it's in interphase, it's not getting ready to divide, right? Mitosis is all about splitting up. Excuse me. So it's not splitting up, right? It's just doing its normal thing, but preparing for the eventual fact that it's going to split. And to do that, it needs to increase what it has, right? It needs to double everything in the cytoplasm. Meaning, all right, if it has 100 mitochondria, it needs 100 more, right? All those, we won't even talk about that in this course, but all those things that we talked about that are in the cell have to get duplicated and doubled because that cell is about to get cut in half, basically. If you cut a cell off in half before growing it, then you have half the size of the cell. And then if you were to cut that one in half, then it would be a quarter of the size. And then cut that one in half, 1/8 of the size, so on and so forth, right? So you can imagine during the cell cycle, that cell has to grow and double itself. That way, when it gets cut in half, it's kind of like back to the original size of the cell. So any questions about that part? That's actually a good time to leave because then what will happen is next Monday, when we get back from spring break, unless you guys want me to come with you to spring break, depending on your answer to that first question, then you're not going to learn about it. But when we come back, then we'll start digging into what happens in interphase, right? So now you know interphase and mitotic phase, and then 2 weeks from now, almost, then we'll come back and talk about what happens in interphase, and that's it. You guys take your 10-minute break. We will. Oh yeah, sorry. The last word for attendance. There is no last word for attendance. So whatever the last question was. Where do you want to go for spring break? Anyway, the other announcement I was going to say that I was going to tell you later is go ahead and send those words in if you want. But today, I'm going back to like it was in the original days of the semester. All of it will be extra credit. So at least send me an email to tell me. No, you don't even need to do that. I see that you're here. But anyway, send them emails if you want, and you'll get your extra credit. Don't send them if you don't want. Doesn't matter. You just won't get the extra credit. Just feel like I need to give you guys some kind of break. Since last week I've been with some riches. We'll keep the light off for now because I'm going to be showing you a few things on the screen before we get started. So after that, I'll turn the lights back on. We'll be back to dark mornings when you guys get back from spring break thanks to daylight savings time. Takes me off. Ready? So you're from Finland?
Yeah.
Do you guys do daylight savings time there?
Yeah.